Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So good to see you all. Hope everybody had a good week and you and your loved ones are safe and well. Thrilled to be here again, moderating tonight's discussion with our esteemed host, Glenn Grossman. As you know, many of you do know, Glenn Grossman is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years and taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology projects with Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, Military Health Service, the CDC, and other programs in the United States and abroad. He is currently Senior Director of Outcomes Research and Epidemiology at Novartis, but all views expressed today are his own. So, Glenn, we've had a busy week, huh? Before we jump into the details, please take us around the country and around the world.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, great. Yeah, I just found this cartoon. I thought it was kind of funny. The election was somewhat close before we heard the results, but the coronavirus results were not close. It's getting worse, and the whole country, in much of the country, especially in this region, is red. And so look until you see this cartoon. Anyway, I thought it was kind of funny. Let's look at the country and the world. So I think that I can start here. So when we look at the country, we are really not doing well. In fact, let me start at the high level and then go in. So you'll notice here our average high in July. Whoops, are you still there? Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, good.
Great.
All right, so great. So you'll notice that our average in July, at the end of July, was around 66,000 cases per day. And so now here we are, November 7th was the latest we had yesterday, where we hit over 128,000 cases. So we're hitting essentially at around twice the rate that we had at the second surge. And we're not anywhere near the end of this surge. This is just going to continue to rise. You can see ever rapidly. It jumped from November 7th at 128,000, November 6th, 125, November 6th, 116, November 4th, 103. When we talk about exponential curves, this is what we're talking about. You see how the line is just going straight up. Part of it is the regional component to it that we've talked about. And so you can see that. In terms of the hospitalizations, they're also rising rapidly. Not quite as rapidly as we saw in the very first surge at the beginning, but certainly on par with the second surge. The death rate is starting to climb back up a little bit, not as fast as the first one, but there was a delay between when we started seeing more deaths and the hospitalizations. And we're just at the beginning of this hospitalization curve. Like I said, typical cold and flu season, it lasts between, say, early October to, say, March or so. Varies a little bit depending on the season, but that's the typical flu and cold season. And so that's the typical coronavirus season that we're expecting. So we're expecting now that we're in November, December, January, February, that things are going to get pretty bad. And this is just the beginning. So we're seeing it rise. When we break this down regionally, you can see that the Midwest is really starting to drive some of these changes now. And it's one of the reasons that we haven't seen the deaths spike as much. And it's because we're seeing it localized in this one area. And so it takes a week or two before people who will ultimately succumb end up dying from it. The other thing that we need to continue to talk about is that the death mortality is not necessarily the worst part about the disease. Mortality, of course, is always among the worst things with any disease, but many people will survive and will have lifelong disabilities, or disabilities that potentially last quite a long time. And so this is something that is also it's the debilities that come out of it, the disabilities, that we really need to not push aside just because people aren't dying. Anyway, other than the regional, when we go into the state level, you see North Dakota is continuing to rise. 2,300 cases was their peak. They're still just noise, whether it's 2,100, 2,300. It just varies a lot on a given day. If we were to compare this to, did I pull this up? Yeah. What I'm going to do is look at cases per million. So Andorra, a small country, is I'm not going to include there. I'm going to include France. France is extremely high. They just jumped up dramatically. I'm going to include Austria, and some of these other bigger countries. So other than France, which hit 1,300 today, that was totally, I wasn't expecting that. They were high, but I didn't realize they'd get so high. Let's look at this. So France and Germany. Let me put Germany in there. Has shut down. Here's Italy. It's not alphabetical. Anyway, here's some that are as a just as a reference point. So you can see that France was at, oh wait, it only says 600. November 8th. Okay, well, for some reason, I'll just use the 800 number. I don't know what the numbers are here. So this is 800. So France is at 840 per million and is one of the leading countries in the world right now. Outside of those other couple countries that were very small, Luxembourg has very, very few people in it. France is a large country. You'd think that they would be doing well. They're shut down now, according as are Germany, UK, some other places in Europe. France is at 800, 840. When you compare that to where we are in the United States, that was 840. And then and other states, other countries in Europe were less than that. Here we are. If North Dakota was its own country, it would be the worst country in the world right now for SARS-CoV-2 infections. You can see that's a classic exponential curve. They haven't stopped it, so it's growing rapidly, and so they're in really bad shape. But it's not just them. South Dakota is bad. Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin. When you look at these, Illinois, these numbers are insanely high. And they're not getting lower. You see that they're exponential curves. Like when you look at Illinois here, it's rising and it's just continuing to rise. There's no evidence that it's reached anywhere near its peak yet. Even Alaska, I wasn't expecting Alaska to be doing, but they're going up, not under control. So the country is in trouble right now. So many of these states are not doing well. Ignore these zeros here. It's just a lack of data that's being reported. But you see some of the states, New Jersey, we're on an upward bound again. One thing I keep on pointing out is that you can't compare the first surge to the second surge because our diagnosis rates were really, really poor in the first surge back in March and April. And the reason that the spread was occurring the reason that the diagnoses seemed to appear so low back then was because it was so hard to get a test. Pretty much the only people that were getting tested were people who were in the hospitals. And so as a result, the ones who got the diagnostic tests were also the ones who were hospitalized in general and most likely to die. And so as a result, the infection fatality rate seemed a lot higher and all these things seemed a lot higher. But now that we have a lot more diagnoses, where New Jersey is almost certainly going to exceed where we were in terms of the number of diagnosed cases back in March and April, but they're not going to be as severe because we have a much wider net in terms of the total number of people who are being diagnosed. Let's see what else we can talk about here. So we talked about some of the regional variation. Here's something I like to look at. So this is the week of the single day recorded cases for each state. This is the record cases for each state. And you'll notice that some of the states were hit early, like New Jersey and New York back in March, April. That's when we hit our record high. But now a lot of the states across the country are now hitting their high this past week. And probably when we look at next week, this is going to shift and their new high will be next week. And we'll probably see a greater shift among many of these states in the coming weeks and months. I think that's it for this one. The other thing that would probably be interesting to look at on this chart is the hospitalization rates. So again, this is consistent with the case rates that we were looking at just a little earlier. So the Midwest is a clear exponential curve. If they don't shut down now, I mean, if you don't have an exponential curve and you have, say, it's a curve like the West, then you could potentially just enforce universal mask wearing, maybe more physical distancing. For businesses, require that there be less people in this business at any one time, but still keep the businesses open. But when you have exponential growth like this, there's no way to bring this back down unless you have some sort of shutdown in different places. We'll get to in a little while some of the dynamics of the election on COVID, which were kind of interesting. But one thing is that a bunch of the places that are being hit hardest right now were the traditional red states. And so there might have been a political motivation not to shut down prior to the election. But now that the election's over, maybe there'd be more of a willingness among some of these states to shut down because they won't care about the optics as much. And for the sake of these people's lives and well-being, hopefully they'll consider shutting down. All right. Other than that, there's a couple other things I can show you here. Whoops. So one is the R value. So we've talked about how infectious it is. Remember at the start when people were wearing no masks, there was no physical distancing, people were not changing their behavior at all. We estimated that in most places, the R was around between 2 and 3. In some places like New Jersey, New York, it was higher. In New York City, for instance, we believe now that it was probably closer to 5 or so. And that was one of the reasons that New York City and New York and New Jersey got hit so hard so fast. But when you look at some of these numbers, Maine currently has 1.5. So even though their absolute number is not very high right now, the rate of growth is high. So we're going to start to see them rise very quickly. And so you'll see some of the numbers, the R values have been going up a lot. So when you look at, let's take a look at Connecticut, for example. So here's Connecticut. Connecticut started at its peak before we really did anything, before we shut down and did anything in Connecticut. They were approximately an R3. That was roughly their R naught when we didn't do anything. We got it under control very quickly. I mean, I don't know if you can say very quickly, but within weeks, we got it back down below 1. And so we got it to really great numbers. It started to come back again during the summer, during June. Again, they let their guard down a little bit. Then they were able to reduce it going in the summer. But then since the summer, it's been slowly creeping up. And so what I mean is the rate of infection has been slowly increasing. So not only has the spread of the virus been increasing, the rate at which it's spreading is increasing. That's what we mean by the R value. And so right now this is a epidemic that's we're seeing exponential growth in many places around the country. A couple other things. Where did it go? So this I like showing sometimes. This is the test and trace dashboard. These are states that are currently geared up with enough capacity to test and then do contact tracing based on the testing. So New Jersey currently has a 1.2% positive test rate. So that's pretty reasonable. That's doing really well. If you get above 5%, then it's considered not doing well because you can't be capturing everyone. But at 1%, it's still manageable if we had our contact tracers up and running. Oh wait, no, it's not 1%. Rather, it's 3.3%. So it's right on the edge. We prefer for it to be under 3%. It's right on the edge of where it should be. The contact tracers are below where we want them to be actually. So I just misread this. The target number of contact tracers per positive test is 5 to 15. New Jersey was was above 5 and was close to 15 for earlier in the year. Now we've fallen below 5. So that means that where we should have a team of 5 contact tracers per daily positive test, right now there's roughly 1 contact tracer per daily test. So we can't keep up with the demand right now. So that means it's only going to get worse in New Jersey. We can try to keep it from getting worse fast, as fast as we can try to slow it down a little bit, but we don't have the capacity right now. There's just not enough contact tracers. One of the reasons is there's not enough funding for contact tracers. The states are required by law to balance their budget every year. They can't take out loans and unless they have a amendment to their as part of their constitutions or whatnot. And so there's no and so the states, whatever their capacity is, unless there's an infusion of funds from the federal government, they simply can't have no other choice. And so unless they take funds away from other places, and I think New Jersey and many of these states have already optimized that. So New Jersey, the two key things here again, 1.2 contact tracers per positive test is bad, and their positive test rate is right above where the target is, should be below 3%. So not doing great. New York is in much better shape. It's close to 5 contact tracers per tester with a 1.5% positive test rate. But when you look at other parts of the country, so for instance, when we're looking at North Dakota has a 12.5% positive test rate, and which is just out of control when target is supposed to be under 3%. And the number of contact tracers per positive test is less than 1. It's when it should be 5 to 15. So they don't have a capacity to bring it under control, even if they wanted to, other than shutting down at this point, because they just don't have the infrastructure set up. And so you can see much of the country is just not where we would need to be. The West and the Northeast are in the best shape right now, but and over here, Louisiana seems to be doing not super bad. They have a 4.3% positive test rate, which is not where they're supposed to be, and the number of tracers is low, but they're not as bad as some of these other states where in the red, where they really do not have sufficient capacity. All right, I think that was all I wanted to talk about today. The one other thing, so now we've had the election. We've had around 238,000 official deaths from SARS-CoV-2. My estimate is that we've exceeded 300,000 actual deaths from SARS-CoV-2 when you look at all of the excess deaths that were not actually diagnosed as SARS-CoV-2, but that died from SARS-CoV-2 like symptoms. So that's almost 300,000. And as I just pointed out, we're on an exponential growth curve here, so things are just about to get worse. All right. Do you have any specific questions about where we are generally, or do you want to jump into the other questions, Rebecca?
Yeah, let's jump in. We have a lot of questions, certainly about the election, but before we turn to that, and before we leave these maps, can you talk a little bit about pandemic fatigue? We talked about vaccine hesitancy. I think that looking at some of these numbers, there are reports of maybe testing hesitancy. What is your sense on that?
Yeah, it's actually something that's really a bunch of people have been looking at that now. So we talked about vaccine hesitancy. I apologize that this slide is somewhat messy. We talked about vaccine hesitancy, where it was this idea that even if a vaccine was approved, a lot of people would not be willing to get a vaccine because they wouldn't trust it. They would think, well, maybe it was rushed too fast by the Trump administration. Some people just are, again, anti-vaccines in general. And so there's this idea of vaccine hesitancy and how do you address it? Well, so now what we're starting to find, in addition to that, is mask wearing hesitancy, where a lot of people just don't feel like they want to wear masks, or testing hesitancy. And so what we're finding more and more is that because of pandemic fatigue, and a lot of people think that it's pretty much over, they don't want to get tested even. And so now that we're getting more and more capacity for testing, where we actually could be testing more, and you see that the testing rates have been going up a lot of people simply don't want to be tested. They tend to use the same type of argument. So there's this one person here who's a member of the far right Constitution Party. And he said he's a 65-year-old, or rather she was a 65-year-old woman. And she says, I will not get tested for SARS-CoV-2. That is my right. And it's this idea of personal liberty, that it's her right not to have an invasive government employee do something, or someone public health do something against her will to her body. even though it's just a swab test. It's an uncomfortable swab test in many cases, though the spit tests and other things are not quite as uncomfortable. But then when you talk to bioethicists, they make clear that as an ethical argument, it doesn't make sense. And I like this quote, and it says, the quote is, it was originally attributed to the philosopher John Stuart Mill, but it's not clear who actually said it. But it's this quote: "Your liberty to swing your fist ends just where my nose begins." And so people have a right to their own personal liberty, but they do not have a right to infect other people or to hurt other people. And so even though she has a right for her own liberty, if she's at risk of potentially infecting other people around her and potentially sending someone to the hospital, then that's not within her legal right, either from an ethics point of view or from a legal point of view. Though I am very confident that in the coming months, when we have a new administration, this public health idea is going to be tested in the judicial system in terms of what is the authority of the government to actually enforce things. So I think in a later week, I can do a deep dive into just sort of my perception on where the legal situation is in terms of public health and what's sort of the currently accepted limits on what the government can and cannot do in public health. But I'm very confident that's going to be tested. There's a lot, this has become very politicized. It's always politicized, frankly, whenever you do these kinds of things. And the legal framework it might be up in the air as well. We'll see what happens with that. But as far as it goes with testing hesitancy, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has agreed that employers can mandate that employees be tested for SARS-CoV-2 before allowing them in the workplace. So employers do have currently have the legal authority to force testing on all their employees, as long as it's consistent with CDC guidelines. And I don't know what currently the CDC guidelines are in terms of the recommendations on that, but certainly with the Biden administration, simply making those guidelines and making them very transparent and widely disseminated would be all the legal authority that employers would need in order to make this happen. And what we're also seeing, one other thing in hesitancy, where this was before the election, so part of it was optics, but even our Congress people and our leaders in Congress, our senators in this case, Republican senators, refuse to be tested. So if the federal government, who are supposed to be the United States leaders, are refusing to get tested, it's hard to even know what to expect just regular Joe citizens to get tested too. So this is a problem. It's a problem that we're gonna have to find ways around in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks for digging into that a little bit more, Glenn. We look forward to hearing more in future conversations. So let's talk more about the election. We have a lot of questions. Thank you everyone who has sent in your questions during the week. And if you have questions that come up tonight, of course, send them to me via the chat and I will do my best to get them into our discussion tonight. If not tonight, certainly next week. But yes, we have a lot of questions about the election, about a number of people have asked, there have been lots of celebrations, lots of mask wearing, but not a lot of social distancing amongst those who are celebrating. Can we expect to perhaps see some more activity as far as the virus spreading over the next few weeks because of that? And specifically, now that Joe Biden is the president-elect, what should he do differently when he's inaugurated on January 20th and or before?
Great questions and very hard questions to answer. Pardon me. So in no particular order, I'm just going to go through some of just my brainstorming that I did about this question. So the very first thing is, will the caseload go up? And the caseload is already going up. So I do worry seeing some of these celebrations. Luckily, at a lot of them, people were wearing masks, but we're in the traditional cold and flu season. Spread is going to continue to happen, and it's just unfortunate. But I mean, people needed to celebrate, so I understand. But I don't know that it's going to go up a lot more versus what it would have gone up on its own, but we'll see what the next couple weeks look like. When it comes to Now that Biden is president-elect, what should we do differently? So I'm just going to read through a bunch of brainstorming activities that I did. All right, or ideas that I identified. All right, so first is crack open the pandemic playbook and update it. So the playbook, the pandemic playbook was to prepare for an outbreak. Now we need a dynamic pandemic game plan. So we're in the thick of it. We've already made a lot of mistakes at the federal level and at the state level. We need to have a coordinated game plan from the experts that we have buy-in, and it needs to be updated and communicated widely. That's the very first thing. Or maybe not the first, because there's some things that lead up to that. So what I have here is the second bullet is we need to rehire or newly hire and fund a diverse pandemic response team. It should be a who's who of top experts in the US, but also include community representatives. Because an expert is just someone, like, they can't just be sitting in an ivory tower somewhere. It needs to be multidisciplinary. It needs to be diverse in all aspects in terms of backgrounds, in terms of perspectives. If they're going to be making recommendations about school closings, for instance, well, then they better have someone representing the school systems and advocates for children's health, for instance, who might be able to look at both sides of the story, because we've seen some evidence that it's not as bad for elementary schools as we thought that it could have been, and vice versa. We need to get to the heart of it. And so that means that we really need diversity of ideas and diversity of backgrounds on the pandemic response team. We need to give the CDC some teeth. We need to get rid of all the head leadership in there now, replace it with people who know what the heck they're doing, and they need to be in the driver's seat, or at least riding shotgun in terms of the pandemic response team, which would be a coordinated team across the federal government. The CDC needs to play an extremely important role, a leadership role. I keep on telling people, I keep asking them just randomly if they know who the head of the current the current head of the CDC is, and people know Fauci's name, but almost no one I ask even knows who the head of the CDC is. Robert Redfield, but most people don't know, and so we need someone at the CDC who, at the Center for Disease Control during an epidemic, is doing enough that people know who the heck they are. Next, do not lie. So this past administration, I mean, we still have it through January, has had nonstop lies. It's been part of their communication strategy was to lie. And one of the very first things that the pandemic playbook had identified when it was previously written was that you needed transparent and accurate communication. If you start lying during a public health crisis or during an epidemic and people do not trust you, then when you tell them to wear masks, when you tell them you need to test, they don't trust you, and they'll refuse to do it. So above all, we need to regain the confidence of the public in the federal government approach to dealing with this outbreak. And so we cannot lie. That has to be one of the top priorities. And so when it comes to data, to not lying, it means not only that, but the data. We need to have standards for reporting, testing, and counting across all the states, so that if you see one state reports one numbers and another reports another set of numbers, that you can actually compare them apples to apples. Right now, there's a lot of lack of coordination. So, and even today, a lot of the tests, people are using different types of tests with different false positive, false negative rates. We need to standardize them in some way. And so that can be something that would focus on. We need to massively fund and increase the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the NPIs that we typically talk about are wearing masks, physical distancing, being outdoors where we can, increasing ventilation indoors where we can, even if that means opening windows when it's 30 degrees outside, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but then blasting the heat. That can be an effective way of circulating the air and getting any circulating virus to very, very low levels. But it's an expensive approach because heating the house that much is expensive. And so, but finding ways to address that would be helpful, particularly in public buildings or schools or other things like that. Nationalized funding and distribution of medical equipment, and personal protective gear. Coordinate and enhance state responses. Right now, the amount of coordination is not where it needs to be. And so we need to dramatically massively increase the amount of coordination and enhance the ability of the states to respond. But make it that the federal umbrella is really driving things. Next, we need to engage. This is I see as a critical one, which the federal government failed at. I mean, the federal government has failed at pretty much all of these so far, but this one in particular is one that a lot of people don't think about, and that's to engage local communities by recruiting local civic leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, school leaderships, etc. All these different leaders from all aspects of local communities, so that we literally have an army of local leaders everywhere, recruit them to have communication with the experts of the federal government regularly, either on a weekly or bi-weekly or some amount of regular frequency with the experts, so that people who are the leaders at schools are hearing from the top on a weekly basis, where you don't rely on just reading the news to see what's going on, where you have the best experts who are looking out for your interests, telling you what to do. Religious leaders. One of the fair complaints that a lot of religious leaders have had are that religious communities are frequently discriminated against. And so if under lockdown conditions where they're told that they can't practice their faith together in a church or a synagogue or mosque, they see it as discrimination. We need to flip the playbook on that and recruit the clergy and recruit the leadership of these religious communities to be part of the fight, to save the lives of the people in their religious communities, to protect the health of people in their religious communities. When you flip the script on this and make them allies instead of adversaries, then you don't even need a lot of the additional funding or power of the federal government. All you're doing is just using the coordination, and this itself provides some of the most powerful interventions you can do. One other thing is that if you require people to change their behavior at the point of the gun or using police enforcement, all it does is turns it into a conflict and combat situation. And people then want to follow your rules even less. So what we need to do is, by engaging the local communities and the local leaders, then you can sort of flip the script and make it more of an idea where people perceive it as their civic duty, as their religious duty, as their community duty, as helping the economy, as their business duty for the business community to work together and help bring this to an end. It's not rocket science to do these things. I'll just go through another slide or two, and then I think that this will be it on the subject. We need to find better ways to protect the most vulnerable. Everyone agrees on this. We talked about the Great Barrington Declaration earlier, where they said, oh, we need to find ways of protecting the most vulnerable, and then we can reopen. Well, I think most people agree we need to find better ways to protect the most vulnerable. And so, for instance, in nursing homes, where we can't just keep them under lockdown, but at the same time, we need to ensure that we protect them and don't increase their risk because they already are at increased risk. And not to claim that I'm a fan of the Great Barrington Declaration in any way. I'm just focusing on this one insight that everyone agrees on, this protecting the most vulnerable. Next, the federal government is one of the largest employers in the US. They need to lead by example. So for instance, mandatory mask wearing, testing, etc., including all consulting companies that do business with the US government, need to adhere to whatever rules are established for the federal government workforce. And so this will be really helpful to lead by example. We need to establish a public health legal response team in the Department of Justice. Like I said, we have the most right-wing Supreme Court since around the 1930s in the United States at this point. And so there's going to be a lot of pushback to some of these public health interventions and requirements of states and other people that are required. And so there's going to be a legal team that's going to be necessary. And so that needs to be a priority. We need to plan for that. Next, there need to be better strategies to debunk bad information and conspiracy theories. And so we need to engage more people in the science of public health, in the mechanics of studies, let people see under the hood. And there's a whole science of the communication of public health. So you can go and get an advanced degree simply in communication of public health. We need to engage those people. They haven't really been engaged to as large an extent at the federal government as they should have been. And we need to activate them and help them get involved for the communication part. We need a systematic, funded, and coordinated approach to epidemiologic studies to answer basic questions that we still haven't answered. Right now, there has been some coordination among investigators, among research organizations, but it hasn't been as deeply systematic at the federal government level. And so what we need to do are dramatically increase that and increase the coordination and the goals. Right now, there's a ton of basic questions about SARS-CoV-2 that we still haven't answered, that we would have been really helpful to know back in March or April or even by the early summer, and we still don't know the answers to. For instance, right now we're still using testing for a lot, like viral testing, either RNA testing or antibody testing for a lot of our studies, when in fact what we really should be looking at our cultured SARS-CoV-2 RNA, because a lot of the RNA actually is not viable. It can't replicate. So who cares if people can't are shedding virus, but they can't infect anyone? That's an indicator. It's still good to study it for for the information it can tell you. But if it's not contagious, if it can't infect anyone else, it's a different interpretation. So we need to be incorporating, culturing the SARS-CoV-2 RNA into more of our studies so we know if it's actually infectious or not. We need systematic funded epidemiological studies to identify prophylactics. So for instance, right now, there have been a bunch of studies looking at statins that I've mentioned previously, that they might reduce the severity of COVID-19, vitamin D, which there's more skepticism now about vitamin D, if that can be involved in the reduction of severity. But right now, the problem is that something like statins, it's a generic drug or a generic class of drugs. And so because it's not branded, there's no return on investment for any company that makes these drugs to do studies to show that it has any impact on COVID-19. Because if you were to spend $10 million, $100 million to do these studies, you'd get $0 back for having done those studies. So there's zero value for anyone to fund it who's currently making the drug. That's one of the key benefits of having drugs that have to go through an approval process that costs more money, is that they are allowed to charge more money because they go through the expense and with resources and time and particularly money to fund the trials that are necessary to prove that they're safe and effective. Right now, but then the benefit for us as a population is that at some point, all these drugs become generic, and then we get the benefit and the value of the drug at much after all that investment has already been done. Once a drug is generic, there's no motivation essentially to investigate them. So the federal government would need to come in and do studies systematically on all these drugs. And these aren't the only candidates. There's many, many candidates out there that have been identified as possible, theoretically possible drug candidates to reduce severity among people who have not yet been infected. So that should be on the list. The federal government should be putting money into those studies because that could be a huge, huge help. Next, and just a couple more after this, focus on health disparities among diverse populations and provide support where needed. We already know that ethnic minorities are at much higher risk. People with comorbidities are at higher risk. There's health disparities in receiving healthcare, and that needs to be part of our response to COVID-19. We can't just let people at higher risk die to a higher extent. We're a caring society, and that shouldn't be okay. Finally, turning globally, we need to get back to where we were and have real global leadership on this. So that includes collaborating with the World Health Organization, but also having US renew its historic global leadership role in preventing and managing outbreaks across the world. A lot of countries, particularly smaller ones that don't have the capacity to deal with this, once we get ourselves up and running, we should be providing assistance, perhaps vaccines, other things like that. We should be helping out the rest of the world. And that'll serve us well, because if the virus mutates, then our vaccines won't be as effective. And so we need to be vaccinating the world, because if there are areas that there's a lot of virus replication that are not vaccinated, then that means mutations can occur in those places, and it puts us in the United States at higher risk. So in order to lower our risk, we should be funding vaccination programs and public health interventions in other countries that could potentially come back and hurt us. Collaborate with China. So if you recall back months ago, I had talked about the United States had epidemiologists on the ground in China. After SARS-CoV-1 hit back in 2003, 2004, we realized we couldn't trust China to tell us if there was an outbreak. And so the United States funded epidemiologists on the ground in China to create a network of epidemiologists in that area and in that region, so that if any outbreak occurred, we'd have people just at the end of the phone that they could quickly call up. We'd be able to drive over and airplane in and parachute in and very quickly find out what was going on. One of the things that Trump did back in 2019 before this epidemic was he pulled out all the US epidemiologists. His rationale was, why should the US federal government tax dollars be paying for epidemiologists in China? They should pay for their own epidemiologists. Well, guess what? We pulled out the epidemiologists, there was an outbreak, and we couldn't jump in and stop it from spreading and infecting the world. We need those epidemiologists back on the ground. Next is collaborate with China to reestablish coronavirus research in bats in China to prevent SARS-CoV-2. If you recall, there was a research program that had been occurring in looking at bats in China to investigate all the different kinds of SARS-CoV coronavirus out there, that or other and different species of coronaviruses that could potentially get out of the bats and create epidemics. They found 400 different coronavirus species circulating in bats that could potentially infect people. We need to have researchers back on the ground there studying these bats so that we can continue studying it and prevent future outbreaks. And if they do occur, we need to be continuing to develop drugs to prepare for those future outbreaks. So those are what I think we should be doing once Biden is actually has the authority to do these kinds of things. But that won't happen until January 20th. In the meantime, is there anything that Biden can be doing right this second to fight COVID-19 as president-elect? And yes, there are many things. The very first thing is that Biden is set to announce a COVID-19 task force tomorrow. So that's Monday, November 9th. And so that's great. He's already started communicating who are going to be in it. It's a task force that's going to be led by 3 co-chairs, former Surgeon General, former FDA Administrator Commissioner David Kessler, and an academic from Yale University. Already discussing who's going to be involved, and so it's great. He's starting to put it together. Like I mentioned earlier, in some of these, there are things you can do just as part of the communication process, and simply by putting together this task force, they can already start to update the pandemic playbook and sort of the game plan that they need and communicate it. And so they can start that whole process now, even without having any authority. Interestingly, and so this is involved with the election too, I thought some people might be interested, looking at national exit polls, how did different groups vote for COVID-19? And so if you start, so this is the exit poll. On this side is people who voted for President Trump. On this side is people who voted for Biden. So among people's top concerns, coronavirus, the pandemic, was listed as the very top concern in the election for 17% of the United States population. Among the people who said it was their top concern, it was their top concern, 82% ended up voting for Biden. And among those who said it was that the pandemic was their top concern, 14% ended up voting for Trump. When people asked about the efforts that the U.S. was doing to contain the coronavirus pandemic, among roughly 50%, so 48%, said that the United States was doing very well or somewhat well, and they ended up voting 78% for Donald Trump. 21% of those who said the U.S. was already doing well voted for Biden. 50% said that the U.S. was doing very badly or somewhat badly in dealing with COVID. 88% of those who said that ended up voting for Biden, and 10% of those who said that still voted for Trump despite that. And then when they asked the question, which is more important, containing the coronavirus now, even if it hurts the economy, 51% said, yes, we should contain the coronavirus now, even if it hurts the economy. 80% of them voted for Biden versus 18% of them voted for Trump. And then among those who said we need to focus on rebuilding the economy now, even if it hurts efforts to contain the coronavirus, 76% of those people. So interestingly, 42% said that yes, that should be a priority. So in the middle of this large pandemic, 42% said that the coronavirus, we should just be ignoring it right now. but that's largely in line with 76% of them supported President Trump. And that was one of the key messaging that we were hearing from Trump during the campaign. 22% of people who said we should rebuild the economy now ended up voting for Biden. There are a couple other interesting things. Just two more slides here. One, this is the most fascinating thing. I didn't expect this at all, although I should have. And so when the Associated Press looked at the 376 counties with the highest number of new cases per capita in the days leading up to the election, 93% of those counties with the highest number of new SARS-CoV-2 infections and COVID-19 cases, 93% of those ended up going for Trump, a rate that was way above other less severely hit areas. So the more likely a county or area was likely to be, the more likely they were to be infected with SARS-CoV-2, the more likely they were to vote for Trump. And that might be related because Trump told them not to care. And if you don't care, then you are more likely to get infected. One final thing, you might be wondering, so the CDC is located in Georgia and it's located in DeKalb County. So how did voters vote in the county in which the CDC is located? And overwhelmingly, they voted for Biden and against Trump. 83% in DeKalb County, home of the CDC, voted for Biden. All right, let's move on to the next thing.
That is a very interesting observation about the CDC. So you definitely put together a comprehensive to-do list for President-elect Biden and his team. And it is exciting to see that parts of your to-do list will be tackled starting tomorrow. So that is exciting. Great. And one of the, towards the bottom of your to-do list, you talked about China and bats. And Debbie, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Debbie has a question, and it came in from others as well, including Sandy, about Mink. So Debbie, if you are, there you are.
Hi, Glenn. So I emailed you earlier this week about the Mink mutation, and you gave me the teaser for Sunday night. So please, let's know about Minks.
Yeah, so let me start here. All right, so as many of you might have read, there was a massive killing of the minks in Denmark, and that's what triggered the news for a lot of people. A bunch of us have been following it peripherally before this, but in Denmark is where the stories really hit the main news over the past week or so. Basically, as you know, coronaviruses are very common in bats, but then they typically might jump species. And when they jump to different species, it causes these mutations. And so then that's when it jumps from those species to humans, then that's when we've had the various species and the different diseases that it caused. So for instance, when it went from a bat to a camel, then that's what caused the Middle Eastern MERS coronavirus. Then that was a human infection. When it went from this, I guess this thing was this type of cat. Whoops, let me make this bigger. So this was a civet, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing right, if it's a civet or a civet. I think it's a civet. That when it jumped from the bat to civet, then that was SARS-CoV-1, the infection that we talked about. This Pagmalion is what we think it jumped to jump and become SARS-CoV-2. So we know that these coronaviruses can infect other species. And that's one of the most interesting things about evolution is that so humans have the ACE2 receptor, and all of these other animals also have the ACE2 receptor, but they're slightly different because it's evolved and changed over time. And so it's one of the key benefits of our understanding evolution as a theory is that helps to understand that how the ACE2 receptor itself has changed over time is part of the theory of evolution and part of how we understand this. So now when we talk about evolution, we've mentioned this previously. I'm just going to say very briefly, anytime that you have evolution in anything, but in particular in viruses that we're talking about now, there's three things that need to happen. It needs to make copies of itself. There needs to be variation in the copies, so mutations, different variation in the copies, and then some form of selection in order for it to become the new form of the virus, a mutant form that becomes dominant. And in this case, because the ACE2 receptor is different in each species, when the virus jumps from one species to the next, it's no longer rewarded for optimizing to that body. So for instance, the SARS-CoV-2 virus right now is optimized for people. It really binds really well with our ACE2 receptor. And so for ACE2 receptors in other species, it wouldn't bind very well with them. And so it wouldn't jump very quickly. But if there was some variation in our SARS-CoV-2 and it was just barely close enough so it could infect another species, then that species with its different ACE2 receptors, the virus would very quickly start to have mutations and be selected for that new animal. And so in this case, their ACE2 receptor in the mink, the SARS-CoV-2, some people with the infection with SARS-CoV-2 infected minks. And it probably happened to multiple places, not just a single person doing this. But minks' ACE2 receptors are not so different than humans when it comes to the binding ability of the SARS coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2. But they are different enough that the virus is now mutated and selected for. So it's optimizing for their ACE2 receptors rather than the human ACE2 receptors. The worry is, okay, well now if it spreads like wildfire among the mink and optimizes for their ACE2 receptors, if it then jumps back to humans, then we might be talking about a SARS-CoV-3. Now, it's unlikely that it would be SARS-CoV-3, which would be a different species, because we're really just looking at a very small shift in terms of SARS-CoV-2. But what we worry about is that what we found is that 12 people have been now identified as being infected with a mutated version of SARS-CoV-2 after it's gone through the Mink's system. And so what they found is, let me just jump ahead here. They've done some genetic analyses. Isn't this mink cute? I just have to say, it's very cute.
I do agree with you, Glenn. It is a very cute little animal.
and so what they found is the spike protein has mutated. And the problem is, if the spike if this were to become common in people, then all of our vaccines, or almost all of them, are focused on the spike protein as it currently is common in humans. If this were to introduce a new version where the spike protein is slightly different, then our vaccines would not be effective. All this work, the 9 months we've been spending trying to make a vaccine as fast as possible, we might have to start from scratch on a completely new vaccine. So this could be a major problem. And that is the reason why Denmark has decided to kill all 15 million of their mink, of their animals in Denmark, affecting roughly 1,100 farms. They're one of the largest, or it is the largest producer of mink fur in the world. So this was a major decision. There is some question about whether it was politically motivated or scientifically motivated. I don't have the key insight here. But what I do know is that when there were outbreaks at Netherlands and some other places, Spain, they did kills in those places too. Unfortunately, and this is one thing that hasn't been reported a lot, in the United States, there have been many outbreaks among our mink population too. So there were 10,000 mink that died from outbreaks in Utah, but because our CDC wasn't very strong, or our federal government was very strong, we were not publicly minded. So it takes a lot of chutzpah in Denmark to demand that whole industry shut down essentially for the year and kill off all of their animals to prevent the infection spreading in people. In the United States, despite the many thousands of infections that have been confirmed, we have not killed the whole herd in Utah or the other states in which it's occurring. Cases have been found in mink in Wisconsin, Michigan, and other places. Yes, this would impact this industry in the United States severely, but if the science supports it, we should do it. Again, I'm not saying I know for sure if the science does support it. There might have been political motivations to kill off the mink, but at the same time, the fact that the virus has mutated and could potentially be a new reservoir for spreading the virus, the mutated forms of the virus, would be something that we would very severely have to look at. And I don't have confidence that our current CDC or federal government would exert the kind of power necessary until the new federal government takes over. There are one other thing to just mention here before we leave it. There have been some other animal species in the United States that have been infected, mostly zoo animals. Like, so for instance, here's an example where a few tigers were infected and we found them. The difference here is that these are just one animal at a time. So the probability, it's like tossing dice. The probability is very low from one toss of the dice. Whereas if you have tens of thousands or millions of mink that are in very close quarters because they're being bred, and so they're in very, very tight cages, like what we typically think of for industrial animal factories, then spread becomes much, much more common. So it's really the industrial approach to this that puts us at higher risk. And so that's why this is more of an issue than some of these other animals that have been infected. Any questions about this?
Thank you for taking us through that, Glenn. Again, something we will all be keeping our eyes on for sure and hoping that is controlled. So we are getting close to the end of our time together. I know we did have a few outstanding questions, and maybe I'll give you a little teaser about what to expect next week, because I know Glenn has put together a lot of information about the longest asymptomatic infection that's been identified so far. Is that person still contagious? So we'll talk about that next week. We're going to talk next week more about heart infections in adults and college age young adults. So we know that this is not just a pulmonary disease. This is a disease that impacts many areas of the body. So stay tuned next week for more on that. But Glenn, how about we wrap up this evening with just kind of touching upon the schools a little bit more, and do we have any more information about the risk of adults the risk of COVID-19, adults with children in schools catching COVID-19?
Yes, so there have been a bunch of studies at this point looking at this question about the risk of contracting COVID-19 in adults who have kids going to school. And so by kids, I mean typically primarily elementary school it's been looked at, but also for the 13 to 18 year age range. With 13 years old is still elementary school. But what we find is that there's a big difference before puberty versus after puberty. So that's why we tend to split up the ages at that level in terms of the spread of COVID, both in terms of the severity of the disease as well as the likelihood of infection or spreading it. But again, people under the age of 20 have an extremely, extremely low risk of having severe disease or having complications from the disease. It can occur, but the risk is very low. But so there have been a bunch of studies published. One of the biggest ones I've seen was looking at 12 million adults in England from the National Health Service there, the NHS. There was a study I saw in Germany. There were some in the United States. But basically, I'm going to focus on this one in England that was just published, just because it was interesting. And it tends to be consistent with what they're finding across all the studies, with some exceptions that we don't know why yet. But generally, they're all coming back to the same conclusion. And that is that the interpretation for adults living with children, there is no evidence of an increased risk of severe COVID-19 outcomes. So this is really great news for a lot of people. It means that we had a lot of concern about shutting down the schools and whether kids could go back. And there is still some risk. This doesn't eliminate the risk. In some places, there have been outbreaks where the schools reopened and we have found outbreaks associated with that. We don't know why it's happening in those rare places. But in many, many other places where it's been looked at now, this is the United States, this is England, this is Germany, we still are finding that it's not as big as we thought that it could be. For instance, in this one, this was again going back to the United Kingdom and England in terms of what they were looking at. They found that for children under the age of 11, there was virtually no increased risk. I mean, slightly, but not really anything clinically meaningful in infecting adults. It increased a little bit more among children over the age of 12, but under the age of 18. But still not dramatic, not these major outbreaks. Also, when they were looking at hospitalization increases, it didn't increase the risk of hospitalization having the schools reopen. In terms of the intensive care unit admissions, it didn't really increase them very much. And it might have actually even decreased the chances of an adult dying if they were infected. And it's not clear why, and it's not clear if it's even true. One of the things that we know is that parents of kids aged 0 to 11 tend to be younger parents than parents with older age kids on average. And so it could be that these parents were younger, so they're less likely to die in general. And so if they got COVID-19, it could be that they were simply at lower risk. And so that might be one of the things that we're seeing here. But right now there's not this major trend that was observed. And so that's really good news. Among people over the age of 65, the data is consistent with this, but not quite as clear. So I'm not going to present it here. I would focus from this study just on the adults under age 65, and then we can revisit those over 65 at a later time. The other thing to keep in mind was the fact that this is published now means that the study was conducted a month or two ago, right when school started, when the weather was warmer. It wasn't really flu-like conditions. It wasn't really flu season. And we've talked about these things, that the weather itself, that the season itself has an impact on how likely things are to spread. So that means that the numbers we're seeing here, although they might represent accurately the beginning of the school year when the study was conducted, might not necessarily represent what we can expect in later November, December, January, February. So, but the fact that these studies are out there, we can't just dismiss them. And yet at the same time, we have to interpret them and understand this isn't the last study and it's still an open question.
Thank you, Glenn. We appreciate you bringing us the most recent data as you get it, and certainly putting it into context for us is incredibly helpful. Okay, so we are going to leave it there. Stay tuned next week for more really useful information from Glenn on so many topics that we've yet to discuss. If you have questions during the week, as always, please send them to me or to Glenn, and Glenn will work on researching answers to those questions, so we will all continue to stay nicely informed. I hope you have a wonderful, safe week. Don't forget to wash your hands and wear your masks. And Glenn, thank you on behalf of your entire audience, both live and virtual later on. Thank you for all that you're doing to be our champion during this difficult time.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And thank you everyone again for joining this week. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.